am I not? I am on.
This is always that the
Beautiful.
bit where you wait to see, am I on, am I not?
Clearly I'm on, all right.
I am on. This is always that the bit where you wait to see, am I on, am I not?
Clearly I'm on, all right. Am I, is that you on your end? That's on?
Oh, I'm not sure. It could be. Let me see.
Am I, is that you on your end? I think we're good now.
Okay, cool.
Beautiful. Hello, Facebook. Welcome to another episode of the Beyond the Comfort Zone podcast, where I talk to experts in the specific areas so that we can get to debunk all the nutrition, fitness, and health myths that are out there that leave people feeling confused and finding it really hard to even begin to be healthy. Like, I want to be healthy. Where do I even start, right? Because there's so much contradicting information out there. Now, today's topic is something that I'm really interested about, but I acknowledge the lack of knowledge in this area, even as a health and fitness professional, because it's not something that we get taught on a lot. You kind of you brush through it, right? It's almost like at the top, the superficial level, but there's nothing that goes at any depth that would give me the confidence to help my clients. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to call in a gut expert on here. And Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro, you're it. So before we kind of move on, why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me on. I always appreciate these opportunities to, as you mentioned, address those gut health myths. So my background started in exercise science, which was my bachelor's degree. And then I went on to study the relationship between the gut microbiome and metabolism for my doctorate. Now that was back in the 20 teens. And so it was a little bit before the time of, the gut health trend that we're existing in now. So I finished that in 2014 and I didn't start speaking about gut health until about 2017. And from there, it seemed like it was a snowball effect that I went from, one podcast to like a podcast almost every day because people were so hungry for more information about it. And at the time, there were very few of us who had formal education in that area. And I can say, as a person with formal education and research experience in that area, that even the researchers are saying like, this stuff is really unclear. And like, we have a lot more work to do in the field to just improve the quality of studies before we can really start making recommendations. But what we see in social media are a lot of really declarative statements and bold claims and interventions and gut programs that are really putting the cart before the horse. So a large part of what I do is science communication and science journalism to provide accurate information in that area.
And I love that. I mean, I came across your webinar series a couple of months ago and I was hooked on it. And I'm like, yes, these are the things that I need to know. And that's when I messaged like, can you come on my podcast? And when you said yes, I was like, yes, right? Because it's such an important area. It's a hot topic right now, literally. Everywhere you go, gut healing, right? Which is part of it's just going to be part of the conversation. But before we move on, for the audience who are new to this whole gut trend, what is the gut? What is a human gut? What does it do? Just the basic functions.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about the gut or the gastrointestinal tract, it's essentially a long tube that goes from mouth to anus, and it is the system that we use to break down our food into the smallest absorbable parts and then absorb what we can. So we break those down with digestive enzymes, and anything that our enzymes can't act on will end up passing through the large intestine. And that's where most of our gut microbiome lives. And that microbiome, which is the microbes and also their genetic material, serve a number of different functions. And you can think of us sort of as a host organism, and we're filled with a bunch of these synergistic organisms. So there's a cooperation there. On the other hand, there are definitely some microbes who are opportunistic pathogens. So they do have the capacity to cause disease in some cases. And so the idea of gut health is that maybe there is some level of balance that needs to be achieved in that microbiome to optimize health and prevent disease. And that a part of the way that we can potentially balance that, if that's the case, is through diet and lifestyle.
Yeah. Do we know what that balance looks like? I mean, if you take two people under the microscope and try to differentiate between a healthy gut and an unhealthy one, would you be able to tell?
It would be really difficult. And even the idea of balance actually comes from ancient Greek medicine. So when we're thinking about like Hippocrates in the time of Galen, back then physicians worked to restore balance in the body. But the balance was in humors. They thought that imbalanced humors cause disease. We know that's not the case now. Now we have enough support for the germ theory of disease that we know what actually leads to it. But that concept of balance being synonymous with health is it's really lasted through the centuries, and it's something that we still apply to health regardless of sort of the absence of evidence that that's the case. And so when we talk about a balanced gut microbiome, there are a couple buzzwords that come up a lot. One is dysbiosis, which a lot of people are probably familiar with. Dysbiosis is often assumed to be an imbalance or an unfavorable proportion of microbes, whereas eubiosis is considered to be the optimal balance of microbes. But those terms are so poorly defined, and at the moment, they're not actually quantifiable. So in other words, we can't look at a gut and say definitively, this person has dysbiosis, and look at another one and say this person is healthy. I want to take a minute to explain why and address something that people might be questioning right now, because there are gut health tests out there that make claims like they can identify whether someone has dysbiosis. You can actually receive a score called a dysbiosis index. Now, the most basic definition of dysbiosis is just a difference between one group compared to a group that's assumed to be healthy. But the issue is that people's microbiomes are different for a number of different reasons that have nothing to do with health, like gender, age, and geographic location, which is one of the most significant factors. So if you, as a healthy person, are compared to another healthy person in a different part of the world, because they are the person you're being compared to, you could be told that you have dysbiosis. And the question is, well, who really has the dysbiosis? Is it you or the other person? Because you're both actually healthy. So it's just, you can see how confusing it is and how there is this there's modicum of science to it in terms of using a valid test, but then it's the interpretation. That's where all the science fiction comes in.
Yeah, and just to give people context, because when I read this on your webinar and I was listening to it, like the amount of microbiome we have, right? How much is that again?
Yeah. So the estimates right now, we could have anywhere from 400 to 1,000 different bacterial species. And bacteria make up the vast majority of microbes in the gut, but then we also have fungi, which are eukaryotic cells. So, and we can have a number of different eukaryotic cells, but fungi would be an example, like yeast. And then we also have archaea, which are kind of similar to bacteria, but they're still different. Then we have viruses. Now, viruses aren't living things, they're not microbes, but they have the machinery to modify human or microbial cells. And we have upwards of, probably about tens of trillions of microbes living in the gut. And so we actually have a few pounds of biomass that exists in our GI tract. And when you think about like the number of microscopic organisms you would need to collect to have pounds of something, that's an almost an unfathomable amount. Like, it's really hard for our brains to process numbers that great. And so what we often do is think about the gut microbiome as just one unit, and it's not. It really is an entire ecosystem.
Yeah. And then we tell people you have this one food item and it's going to balance everything out.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yep. Or you have just like, or they say, just get rid of the bad microbes, and it's just kind of like, oh my gosh, the oversimplification there is so misleading.
Absolutely. And that is a perfect segue into my next question, which is, the leaky gut, right? And that is just another hot topic online, and it drives me insane. So my question is, what is a leaky gut? And is that an actually recognized scientific term / diagnosis, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. This is such a great question because it's another example of where the science and science fiction really get confused. So leaky gut is sort of the layman's term for altered intestinal permeability. So when you are imagining your gastrointestinal tract, we're going to focus just on the intestines. So in the small intestine and in the large intestine, you have a single layer of what we call epithelial cells, and they're supported by connective tissue. In most of the small intestine, most of those cells are designed to absorb nutrients. And then the same thing can be said for the large intestine. There's just less absorption that goes on there. And these intestinal cells are stuck together by proteins. And ideally, we have controlled levels of permeability of the intestine. That means that there are things that are allowed to pass between the cells. And then there are things that are really tightly regulated, and they have to be processed in the cell first before they can enter circulation. So you can think of that sort of like a wall or the moat around a castle, that it is selectively permeable. So with altered intestinal permeability, what happens there is that there's either a dysfunction or just a loss of those proteins that hold the intestinal cells together. Now we have an abnormal amount of space between those cells, and so we have an abnormal amount of permeability. So we might have larger compounds or molecules moving between those cells, and then they're going to interact with the connective tissue beneath those cells, which contains a lot of our immune tissue, a lot of our immune cells. And then when that happens, our body could mount some sort of immune response. So one example would be like a food allergy. That's one of the theories for the way that food allergies develop, and that it's based on kind of like early life intestinal permeability and what those immune cells come into contact with.
Yeah.
So altered intestinal permeability is actually a thing that happens. We can measure that after a high-fat meal, after very intense endurance exercise, after a really intense bout of resistance training. We tend to see altered intestinal permeability. In other words, we see that the gut is quote unquote leaky. There are things moving through that we wouldn't normally expect to see. But leaky gut is not actually a disease. So it's not something that would be diagnosed. And there are no outward symptoms of altered intestinal permeability. So you might have GI distress and intestinal permeability at the same time, but you can also have GI distress without intestinal permeability and vice versa. So while we can measure intestinal permeability, it's again, something that would be used for research purposes and not really for a clinical diagnosis. And likewise, there's really no treatment specifically designed for altered intestinal permeability, although there have been some interventions that have shown to reduce the permeability that we would see associated with intense exercise or inflammatory bowel disease. Yeah.
So what you're saying is you could have a reduced intestinal permeability, but not feel it essentially.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yes. And we haven't linked that causatively to any disease. So we have some correlations or some relationships between altered intestinal permeability and certain disease states, but it's kind of a chicken or egg problem. Like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? So do we have altered intestinal permeability first, and then we develop something like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as a result? Or does the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease somehow impact our intestinal wall, and then the permeability develops?
Okay, so someone could have it, but have no idea that they have it until something else happens, and then they're like, okay, you actually have this, but you don't know what's caused it, essentially.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. There's also a lot of misinformation, because what I see online, and honestly, Gabrielle, is one of the reasons why I don't join weight loss groups, even though I'm a health and fitness professional, because the type of messaging on there drives me insane, and I haven't got the patience for it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you see, online and stuff like that, when someone starts to talk about how bloated they are, or they have crampy or have discomfort in any shape or form, the advice is, oh, you have a leaky gut, you need to cut out wheat, sugar, and dairy.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any truth to that whatsoever? I'm assuming not, but I just wanted to come from you.
Yeah. Oh, sure. So, the causes of GI distress, bloating, abdominal pain are so numerous.
Yeah.
So if a person is experiencing GI distress, if they've noticed a change in their bowel habits, my first recommendation is always to go either to their GP if they need a referral, or go directly to a gastroenterologist. Those are the physicians that are specifically trained in the GI tract, and then they are going to be using clinically valid, vetted ways of testing your health status and then treating you. Yeah. Whereas if you go to another type of practitioner that's practicing alternative medicine, it's very plausible that you may end up getting a pseudoscientific diagnosis and then being treated with a pseudoscientific intervention. And that could really delay the diagnosis of a real problem and then actual treatment. And that could potentially be life-threatening. If someone has something like an inflammatory bowel disease, they're having, that's going to impede their nutrient absorption. The ulcerations that develop can put them at risk of bacterial translocation or leakage into circulation and having severe infections. So I always want to stress that if you're feeling that something is not right, go get that checked out.
Yeah.
If a person ends up with either a clean bill of health or a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, I can understand how that would be frustrating, because it's like, well, I still don't feel good, so tell me what's going on. In those cases, in the case of IBS, your tissues are normal and healthy. Your intestinal tract is not being damaged in any way, but there is something amiss with both the gut-brain connection and just the functionality of the intestinal tract. So your intestinal tract is performing sort of abnormal contractions. It's not moving food just in one direction smoothly as you would expect. And also you can have a hypersensitivity to the normal processes of the intestinal tract and really perceive that as a lot of abdominal pain and a lot of bloating. So if that's the case, there are definitely dietary and lifestyle management techniques. So one would be a short-term and systematic removal and reintroduction of foods that are known to cause a lot of gas and bloating.
Like FODMAP.
The FODMAP. Yeah, exactly. So that would be like the FODMAP process. Yeah. There's also evidence that light intensity to moderate intensity physical activity can help. Yoga has been shown to have some efficacy, and even hypnotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, that doesn't change the IBS activity necessarily. You're not going to cure yourself of IBS, but because there is such a strong psychological component, it could reduce your perception of the discomfort or make it easier for you to just cope with the discomfort. And then when we're thinking about those dietary interventions, it's really just increasing the awareness of the foods that you do tolerate well to maintain as much dietary variety as possible and stay comfortable. And really that can be said for a person who is completely healthy. They don't have IBS or anything like that. They're still having some GI distress. A lot of the foods that that are popular in the fitness industry contain FODMAPs because they're found in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, and also in a lot of low calorie, low carb sort of diet products, because we have either those functional fibers like inulin, or chicory root is another name that we see that under, and then sugar alcohols. And so all of those ingredients can cause a lot of GI distress. Yeah,
I personally I have some form of IBS, but it only plays out when I'm anxious. I remember when I was at uni during exams, that is the worst possible time for my gut, because I'm always running to the bathroom, TMI, but it happens, right? So I guess the whole idea around doing yoga is very much around calming down the nervous system to reduce that stress that's happening.
Yeah, that's one of the theories. There's a correlation between psychological stress and GI symptoms. Again, we don't have a cause and effect relationship, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence. And certainly there was actually a really interesting study that was done in people with IBS. They were provided either a blinded placebo, that means they didn't know they got a placebo, or they got an unblinded placebo. In other words, the doctor said, this is a placebo. Sometimes placebos help people feel better. This is literally not, it's a sugar pill. And they were like, okay, so in both cases, they took the placebo. And the people who got the open label, the unblinded placebo, they still felt better taking the placebo, knowing that it was one. And the people who got the blinded placebo, they also felt better. And one of the most significant deciding factors that determined whether or not a person felt better was whether they thought they were going to feel better.
Yeah.
So, so I really think that drives home the idea of our perceptions changing the way that we feel physically. We're changing the way that we interpret whatever physical signals we're getting.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of, when your kid is sick and they're not going to school and you take them to the doctors, the moment you get to the doctors before they even see the doctor, oh, mom, I'm fine now. I'm like,
Oh, for sure.
right?
Yeah, because even, and that can be said for alternative medicine as well, that there is really a strong placebo effect because there's just something about a person being present with you, sitting and listening and allowing you to vent and get some stress relief and that you're being cared for. Even looking at just like the power of touch. Like massage in and of itself that's not the thing that's helping us feel better. It is the compassionate touch from another person in the form of a massage in that case. Like that alone will help us feel better.
Yeah, you're not changing the fascia in any way by massaging.
Right, exactly. That is exactly it. Yep.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, so another thing that I thought we'd kind of touch on as well, because it appears everybody and their grandma is on this thing, and this is probiotic, right? Yeah. So what are probiotics, and do we all need to take probiotics for our gut health?
So a probiotic is, according to the World Health Organization, and this is the definition right now, and it could change. And I think also it's the ISAP definition. That's the International Society of something probiotics. But it is, they're live microorganisms that when ingested in adequate amounts confer some benefit to the host. So in order for a microbe to be considered probiotic, it has to have shown some efficacy in research that when a person or a rodent ingested this specific microbe, something about their health improved. So where this gets confusing is that a lot of people think that like fermented foods are all considered to be probiotic because they contain microbes. That's not actually the case. Right now, the only food that's considered to be probiotic is fermented dairy, because fermented dairy specifically has shown to improve markers of cardiometabolic health. But other fermented foods just haven't been supported by evidence yet. They could be, there's still a fairly limited amount of evidence and just a limited number of studies. And there are so many different fermented foods. So just keep that in mind, that like the fact that something's been fermented may mean that there are live microorganisms in it, but not necessarily, because those microorganisms could have died off after metabolizing all of the available carbohydrates. They could have been killed during the pasteurization process. And then you were only going to get live microorganisms if they put them back in after the pasteurization process, which is what we would see in dairy. But if you're looking at something like fermented sauerkraut or kimchi, those microbes are not necessarily probiotic, and you're not necessarily ingesting them in adequate amounts either. So those are just fermented foods, but not probiotic foods.
Yeah, and it's also my understanding that to take a probiotic, it has to be specific to the disease that you're trying to help yourself with, right? That the specific strain that you need for it to work, right?
Yes, exactly. So people might not be familiar with the term strain. It can be a little bit confusing when we're talking about like strains and species. Now, the issue is that there are so many different microbes and so many that we haven't discovered yet. Like we haven't been able to map their entire genome like we have with humans. They have like maybe hundreds of times more genetic material than we do. So when we think about like the taxonomy or like the organization of microbes by their genetic relatedness, that's changing fairly often because we're like, oh, actually, like we thought this microbe was related to this other one, but it's actually like this distant cousin. So I like to break it down to the species level is where we would think about the difference between like a dog and a wolf. So dogs and wolves can interbreed. And then they create a wolf dog hybrid. Now that's not necessarily the case with bacteria, but that's the level of genetic relatedness. But, when you're thinking about like, what house pet do I want? You want a dog. You don't want an undomesticated wolf. And that's the same thing that we can say when it comes to microbes is that the strain specificity is the difference between a dog and a wolf. Yeah. So it's not a complete parallel because like, again, microbial taxonomy is a little bit different. And even like the definition of a species of bacteria isn't completely decided. But when we say strain specificity, that's what we mean. So you can have a number of different strains of E. coli. E. coli niscile, a specific strain, is probiotic, whereas other forms of E. coli produce toxins that will cause you to become ill. And we really have found that in most cases, the specific strain of bacteria is going to be most effective for a specific health issue. And it's usually going to be related to GI health. Like that's where we see the most efficacy is for diarrhea, traveler's diarrhea, antibiotic associated diarrhea, and some of the symptoms of GI diseases. But there's no probiotic that's like a kitchen sink probiotic, like a multivitamin that will just confer general health benefits. And there have been some studies that have shown that even in people who continue to take probiotics, they'll see some changes in the fecal microbiome for maybe the first 2 to 4 weeks, and then they revert back to baseline at somewhere between 6 to 12 weeks. So like you're taking the probiotic, but something has changed to the point that it's not being reflected in your fecal samples. And so it might mean that it's not being as effective passing through. But again, we don't know that. Like there's so much that's unknown about how probiotics actually work and to what extent and how much and how long we need to take them to get that benefit.
Yeah, there's also a recommendation of taking probiotics if you're on antibiotics. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that was kind of like conventional recommendation. It almost seems like so logical that it just became conventional knowledge. But there is a study that came out a few years ago that really tested the theory that probiotics would improve reestablishment of the microbiome after antibiotic use. What they found was in that case, using just a selection of lactobacillus containing probiotics, they found that the probiotic supplementation actually delayed reestablishment of the prior microbiome after antibiotics, theoretically because in that environment of such low diversity, the probiotic microbes were able to thrive, and without competition, they sort of populated, and they pushed out the native microbes. They prevented them from returning to their previous numbers. What they found to be most effective was something called an autologous fecal transplant. Essentially, they put a person's own fecal transplant back into them. That makes sense, right? You're just like taking your previous microbiota and putting it back in. That's not really feasible for people, and I don't recommend DIYing that. So the next best thing, don't do that. The next best thing was just to return to their previous lifestyle habits, not to take the probiotic, just to go back to what they were doing before. The exception to that would be if you're experiencing antibiotic-associated diarrhea, then a probiotic would be helpful. And in that case, you'd be looking at something like S. boulardii. It's actually a yeast And that probiotic organism has been shown to reduce antibiotic-associated diarrhea. But again, that's like if you're experiencing that. Not every antibiotic is going to have the same impact on the gut microbiome or on bowel habits. And so you may take one that is not as strong or for a short period of time and not have any issues and just, continue on with your healthy lifestyle habits.
Yeah, beautiful. Let's get on to the cleansing world.
Yeah.
So I hear a lot of this stuff, and especially when it comes to gut cleansing, but I haven't really even wanted to dig deeper into that because it's just scary what people are going to put in their body. And I just wanted you to kind of go through that a little bit. What kind of gut cleansing practices have you come across, and do they actually work? Secondly, how dangerous are they?
Yeah, they are. This is probably one of the most dangerous areas because there are kind of two main methods, and both of them are hazardous. So one is that you ingest something that has a laxative effect. And in many cases, these would be stimulant laxatives. So they cause excessive contractions of the intestinal tract via nervous system activity. In other cases, they might be osmotic. That means that they attract a lot of water into the intestine, and then that causes rapid transit as well. So you're essentially giving yourself diarrhea for some period of time. And diarrhea causes a lot of water loss as well, and it seems to flush out a lot of the resident microbes that like to live in the lumen, like the inner tube of your intestine. So you could think of that as like, oh, okay, that sounds good. It's cleansing, right? Well, you actually don't need that to move fecal matter through your intestinal tract. Not only are you having those kind of perceptible contractions that signal to you, oh, I need to have a bowel movement, but at regular intervals, your intestinal tract is doing sort of a clean sweep set of contractions from one end to the other. So food is constantly moving through. So you're doing your own cleansing. And then of course we have things like, your lungs and your kidneys and your liver and all of that, but that's outside the GI tract. So that would be one issue, is that like you're giving yourself diarrhea, you're reducing your nutrient absorption, you could be causing some dehydration, and then you're flushing out resident microbes. And you can't just flush out, quote unquote, the bad ones, flushing out everything.
Yeah.
The other way that people do this sometimes would be through colonics. So that's when a solution is inserted or is injected rectally. So some people do like coffee, water use, or saline solutions. So there's definitely a risk of perforation of the intestine in that case, that could be life-threatening. And then there's also the potential for infection. If you're having something that's not a sterile solution, it can also cause diarrhea, and it also tends to flush out the gut microbes, and it could cause irritation of the gastrointestinal tract, depending on what you're using for that. So both of those are really hazardous and don't provide any benefit at all. Like literally, I can acknowledge there are hazards to anything that we might use, even if it's a pharmaceutical drug, but the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. And that's not the case when it comes to these cleansing routines. Now, if a person has maybe an anatomical abnormality that prevents their stool from moving normally, or a person is really constipated and the stool softeners haven't worked, maybe a person might need to use an enema, but that's something that has been packaged in a specific way that is safe to insert into the rectum and is used short term. And it's not for cleansing. It's literally just to be able to produce a bowel movement. But it still wouldn't be ideal to do that very often either. It's kind of like if you need it and a doctor has recommended it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you're, apart from being a researcher and the amazing job that you're doing in this field, you're also a coach. So you see clients and things like this. From your experience, why do you think people resort to these methods, right?
I think, that's a big topic, why people would risk their health in order to achieve weight loss. certainly comes down to our shared values of health, and how we attach health and body size. We attach morality to that in the same way we attach it to food choices. And that the root of it is that people think that they need to be their smallest selves in order to appear healthy and valuable and a worthy member of society, and to feel safe that they will be accepted and they'll belong and they'll find a partner and be taken seriously, and a whole number of things that are not actually true. But when you think about it in that way, then it really does make sense that people will go to any means necessary. You know, they'll go to dangerous lengths to fix what they think is the problem preventing them from reaching some idealized body weight. And they're also given the message that if you're having difficulty losing weight, something must be wrong with you. And they're being sold the idea that, oh, it's your gut health. It's this, you have dysbiosis. You have to do a gut reset.
Hormones, Gabrielle, it's those hormones. You need that hormone balancing diet, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So gut health is, because it's so unknown and it's so poorly understood, there's so much gray area for misinformation and very bold interpretations of the literature that does exist.
Yeah. And also when people who come on, who have access to platforms that are huge, right? Mm-hmm. Social media, Instagram, someone has 1 million followers, right? And when they're posting content out, sounding smart, using big words, right? For someone who's not educated in the basics of nutrition or even human physiology, it kind of makes sense what they're saying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Sounds realistic, right?
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that they know enough, or they're using terminology that sounds scientific and they're saying it confidently, and they have their shirt off and they have abs or something like that, and people are like, oh, well, this person must know what's up. And not to say that these people don't have any level of scientific literacy. I'm sure that they do. The issue is that even those of us with scientific literacy will sometimes look at an article that's been published about the gut microbiome and go like, well, what is this method that they used? And like, what is this graph actually representing? And if you're only reading the abstract, you might actually be getting the author's misinterpretation of what the data actually showed. And I'm not a statistician. So even I, when I'm looking at some of these papers going, oh, this seems weird. It seems a little fishy. I don't know about this. I can't just at first glance say, this wasn't the proper statistical test. I do have to refer sometimes to my colleagues and ask, I can't tell exactly what's up, but this just doesn't track with the rest of the literature. Mm. But if you haven't really gotten into the rest of the literature, it's also hard to just pinpoint that, to be able to identify like, that's odd. These authors have reached a conclusion that no one else has reached and actually seems counter to the consensus at the moment. Not to say that it's not possible, but it's improbable. And let's kind of figure out what might be going on in this. If you want to believe that paper is accurate, you're probably not going to look for anything else that would contradict it.
I mean, it confirms your biases, right? Like confirmation bias is a huge thing when it comes to how we read studies and how we interpret studies. Like I'm doing my master's in psychology right now, so I have a whole new respect for people who do research. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it is so complicated to run studies, especially human trials and stuff like that, and to now read studies in a way that will kind of keep you scientifically honest, to say, you know what, okay, and not allow it to confirm your bias and actually keep challenging those thoughts and questioning yourself. It's really hard to do that, right?
Oh, yeah. I think that's something that you have to do intentionally, is identify like, what are my biases? What are the current set of beliefs that I have right now? What would it take to change my mind? If you say like nothing will change my mind, then you're really not being scientific. That's not a scientific way of thinking. That's not intellectually rigorous. That's just saying, I think that I know best and nothing will change my mind. And I really have the most respect for people that I have seen publicly change their opinions in the face of evidence. I mean, my hat goes off to those people, and I have done the same thing where I'm like, oh, actually, this thing that I said was inaccurate and maybe even a little bit harmful. And that's okay. Like, we make mistakes and we learn, ideally, hopefully that's what's happening. But, as we were chatting about before we started, there's definitely a risk to admitting when, you've been wrong, or to acknowledging it. And I think a lot of people want to sell the idea that they know a lot about gut health and gut microbiome science because it's such a big topic right now. It's such a huge selling point. And it's just like a rife with opportunity, to put out content or a program or what have you, to sell people a bunch of problems that they probably don't have, so you can sell them the solutions.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of us, we attach so much of our identity with what we do, right? And then you're standing there, you're going, I don't know, I was wrong. That can be really challenging, because then you're asking yourself, oh, are people really going to take me seriously now? But that's what being an evidence-based practitioner is, being okay to say, you know what, I didn't know then, but this is what we know as far as the current evidence goes, and right? Being able to change your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like the intersection of the best level of evidence, and then whatever your clinical experience is, or non-clinical experience, and then the individualization of whatever you're doing to whomever you're working with. But really, the foundation of that has to be some level of intellectual humility, so you can recognize, like, if you've gone down the incorrect path. And even with good intentions, I firmly believe that most people who are putting out this content have good intentions, and they want to help people, and they're doing their best to do that. It's just that it is a really complex, unclear field at the moment, and even the researchers are putting out a lot of content calling into question some of the trends, and pointing out this issue of definitions and the issue of replicability, and that's great to see. But it's also a sign that we need to remember that this is a really new field, and it's not as established as, like when we're thinking about just nutrition science, which is still something where we're learning new things, but we have so much more evidence to support, for example, the importance of fiber or limiting saturated fat. And the microbiome literature is in its infancy compared to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if we were going to talk about how to maintain our gut, right? For, say, someone who isn't in a diseased state, let's say they haven't got things like celiac disease or Crohn's or anything like that, right? And they just want to be healthy. Are there any foods that they need to avoid, right? Or any foods that they need to specifically bring in to help them maintain their gut health in any way?
Yeah, so I kind of look at this from a couple of angles. One is the more acute, like, how am I feeling as I digest my food angle? And then there's the long-term, how do I prevent gastrointestinal diseases, whether it's something that would be infectious versus a chronic disease. So acutely, if a person is experiencing GI distress, doesn't necessarily mean that the GI tract is being damaged, but all other things controlled for, and they don't have a disease, it's probably something that they're eating that they don't have a digestive enzyme for. So the most common would be lactose. Then there are plenty of those FODMAPs that we just have never had the digestive enzymes for. And so we're eating some combination of those foods, and it's creating a lot of gas and bloating and maybe some loose bowel movements. And then we could do a short term, like we mentioned, the dietary, the systematic process of elimination and reintroduction. And so that is, again, not something that's going to affect the gastrointestinal tract tissues. It's just going to help us feel more comfortable. when we're thinking about long-term disease prevention, in most cases, we're thinking about something like colorectal cancer. So that's something that's actually been, it's occurring in people earlier in their lives now, into the mid 40s. And that has been associated with long-term dietary patterns. So if a person wants to support their health and longevity long-term from a gut health angle, the two most effective dietary patterns would be the Mediterranean diet and then the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, or the DASH diet. And that's actually been shown to reduce the risk of colorectal cancer by about 20%. That's really noticeable, that's really significant. And what those diets have in common is essentially that they are based on minimally processed fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, so very plant-centric. They limit red and processed meats. They emphasize more fatty fish or lean fish and low-fat dairy and things like nuts and seeds, and very small amounts of alcohol. And the Mediterranean dietary pattern, I think, has recently also integrated like physical activity. And the DASH diet is about reducing sodium by in several ways, but one would be reducing processed foods. So in doing that, even though it sounds very unsexy, like that's one of the best ways that we can prevent a number of different diseases later in life. And then the other aspect would be general, just physical activity. We've seen, that's also very protective across the lifespan. And there's some evidence that maybe physical activity is also associated with some specific microbes that are known to produce butyrate, which is an energy source for the intestinal cells. There are some diseases that are not preventable, like IBS, IBD. And so it's just really about like management with those, but still this stuff all will still apply. Like you can still prevent other diseases down the line. And when we're talking about prevention of infectious disease, there are some probiotics that appear to be helpful. Aspulardi that I mentioned earlier, that seems to be helpful for travelers' diarrhea. And then there are some strains of lactobacillus and another species that escapes me right now. But the foundational practice would be like proper hygiene and limiting your intake of food and water from places that seem like they don't have great hygiene. That's like the best thing, and wash your hands. So it's all just very basic, straightforward, like not super exciting. But that's just where the literature is right now. We haven't found anything else that has blown that out of the water to say like, there's a certain food that you have to eat or that you must eliminate. It really just is still that same old like prudent dietary pattern and
basic
activity.
Eat your veggies, consume enough protein, exercise, sleep, right? Be happy. Get
yes.
We're done.
Yeah, and like wash your hands so that you don't, give yourself an infectious disease and then have to take antibiotics for 3 weeks or something. I mean, nothing against antibiotics, they're helpful when you need them, but it would be great if you needed them less often because you were practicing proper hygiene.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were talking about fiber and stuff, it got me curious when it comes to ketogenic diets. I'm not sure if there are any studies there that are showing any association between ketogenic diets and gut health discomfort, maybe gut health issues. Do we have any?
Yeah, so they've looked at ketogenic diets and paleo style diets as well. So they tend to be a little bit higher in fat, a little bit higher in animal products. And depending on how someone adheres to them, they might also be deficient in fiber. Not necessarily. A person could potentially eat a ketogenic diet and emphasize that whatever carbohydrates they are ingesting would be from, fruits, vegetables. Maybe they're not really eating whole grains, but they're still providing a variety of soluble and insoluble fiber. But if a person were to be eating a lot more of like the red meat, like kind of bacon and cheese style ketogenic diet, which, some people do, or like a carnivore style diet that's completely devoid of dietary fiber. What we've seen in rodent studies is that these microbes, and in humans, these microbes are largely dependent on carbohydrates. So most of what we see in the large intestine are called obligate anaerobes. That means they don't do well in the presence of oxygen, which is why they do well in the large intestines, very low oxygen environment. And because of that, they rely heavily on the anaerobic process of fermentation of glucose. And that's how they produce energy for themselves. And so when we reduce their access to carbohydrates, there are some that can ferment proteins, short proteins called peptides, but that can produce some compounds that are associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer, like p-cresol. And then there are others that say, hey, well, if you're not going to eat any carbohydrates, we're going to get them from the protective mucus layer of your large intestine. And so they will actually metabolize that mucus layer and break it down and make it much thinner than it actually should be. And that is one of the physical defenses that we have against pathogens. So they have shown this to be the case in rodents. This really hasn't, to my knowledge, unless I'm missing something, they haven't shown the same to be true regarding the mucus layer, but it also would be really difficult to do this because you can't just like take a whole section of a person's intestines out and, you know, measure the thickness of the mucus layer. Like we can do biopsies, but
ethical reasons, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. For ethical reasons, not allowed to do that. So that's likely what's going on is it's just a lot harder to perform microbiome studies in humans to that level of detail. But there have been plenty of human studies that have shown that these dietary changes do reproducibly change the composition of either the gut or the stool microbiome. And so they start to favor more of the microbes that can ferment proteins like Bacteroides. And those are also associated with increased risk of colorectal cancer. And then we see lower levels of things like bifidobacteria, which are not only probiotic, but we also know them to be really important native inhabitants of the gut that produce butyrate. So essentially it breaks down to an increase in the proportion of microbes that we think like may not be great, and a reduction in the proportion of microbes that we're pretty sure are helpful for us.
Yeah. Is that reversible, do you reckon? So if someone was in a ketogenic diet and have seen all these issues, can they reverse that when they go back to the eating more fiber eating? Yeah.
I mean, the composition that you would have after coming off of a ketogenic diet may not be the same as what you had before going on the ketogenic diet, because the way that your microbiome responds to an increase in dietary fiber depends on the baseline microbes that you started with, because we need to remember, like, they're interacting with one another and the environment, being our intestinal tract, and with those nutrients. But they've shown that these dietary modifications can significantly change the composition of the gut within 24 hours. Whether or not those changes are sustained long-term, it really is probably person specific, because there's some evidence that if you were to eat a ketogenic diet, that you may revert to baseline even though your dietary pattern has changed, or something closer to baseline. So there is a level of resiliency in the gut microbiome that it will kind of, as much as it can, stabilize somewhere close to baseline. Because and not even in terms of just like taxonomy, who's there, but in terms of functionality. A lot of these microbes can do the same things. So like if you lose one group, another group can come in and do the same thing. So the functionality isn't lost. And there's a general trend toward looking at functionality more so than the taxonomy, and probably functionality is more important, because like, do we really care as much who's there or like what they're doing?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The human body, from what you're telling me, the human body is amazing at maintaining homeostasis, right? It just kind of knows how to balance itself out which is pretty incredible.
Yeah. There's there's like they call this the Anna Karenina principle, which is from like a classic piece of literature that the quote is something like, every family is unhappy, but each family is unhappy in their own way, or something to that extent. And that's kind of how the microbiome is. Like, there's such a high level of person to person variability that our microbiome is, it's as individual as a fingerprint. And even in identical twins, their microbiomes will not be identical, even though they share like they're almost copies of one another in terms of genetic material. And that shows that, it's partially genetics, it's partially that we're humans, and it's partially where we live, but it's also a result of like all of the different things we've been exposed to and all the things that we eat and the people that we spend time with and whether or not we have a pet. There's so many different factors that influence the microbiome. In the same way that there are a lot of different factors that influence any ecosystem that we would be able to observe in the outside world. But overall, it finds some way to maintain functionality so it doesn't completely collapse. Like you probably won't find a person who like took antibiotics and then all of their gut microbes were dead after that and never returned, never rebounded from that. So it is really incredible to see that it is that resilient. But then that also really complicates the idea of, dysbiosis and eubiosis. Like, is this really bad? Does a person with IBD, is that a bad microbiome that they have, or is that like the best that they could hope for, considering that they have an inflammatory bowel disease?
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about hormone balancing diets, and then I'm going to let you go. I can talk to you for such a long time. Okay, so when people talk about hormone balancing diets, here's the thing. In my head, when you break down these diets, right, the advice is usually eat your fruits, eat your vegetables, eat your protein, go exercise, right? Mm-hmm. So the advice is decent, sure, but it's the stories behind it, right? That you need to balance your hormones to achieve this health state. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think I'd also would point out that, in some cases, a person could have altered hormonal production and activity because they've been in a deficit for, months or years and over exercising, and their body has entered a state of, we're not going to be making babies anytime soon because we don't have enough energy. And so if the hormone balancing diet has just coincidentally provided them with adequate nutrition, like their cycle is going to return. And then they think that it's like a result of this specific hormone balancing diet when it was really just energy availability. And I think that this is the same, this can be said for gut health as well. So when people are like, what do you think about doing a gut health diet? If saying that it's for gut health is the only thing that is going to inspire a person to start eating in a way that supports their long-term health and their longevity and their mental health and and all of these different really important aspects of well-being, if we have to say this is for your gut health, okay, I'm kind of willing to do that. Because like you said, it's about the stories. It's not like no one really wants to follow like the standard dietary guidelines. Like in the US, people are like, these guidelines are trash. Like, no, they're actually not, but no one really follows them. Like people aren't getting the adequate amount of exercise. They're not limiting processed foods and eating fruits and veggies. That is not what people want to hear. They don't want to hear just like, this is the information, this is what you should do. They have to have some story attached to it. Like, this will balance my hormones, or this will balance my gut. Like, this is meaningful to me rather than just the like very boring, like, get 5 servings a day of fruits and vegetables. So like, I don't even know what a serving is. I don't know what that looks like. But to say like, a lot of dietary diversity that like will improve your gut health. And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to start journaling about like all the different types of fruits and vegetables that I'm eating. And I'm going to get to 30 in a week. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if that's what it takes, I wish that it didn't though. I wish that we could say like more transparently, you're not eating enough calories. And that is why you're not having a cycle. And here's how you can fix that. You eat enough calories. But
the problem that I have with it is that it disempowers people because they feel like I need to do action step A before I can achieve B.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. When that's not the truth, because it's not a thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's what I say about gut health. I'm like, I've created a working definition of it, but like, it's not actually really a thing. Like we can talk about like gastrointestinal disease prevention. We can talk about like digestive comfort and bowel habits. We can talk about gut microbiome diversity. Those are kind of the 3 Ds that I call gut health. But like you don't have to fix it. Like, there's not something wrong with your gut health overall, right? Like if you have a disease, address that. If you have digestive discomfort, address that. If you have a pathogenic infection, address that. But I agree that I don't want people to be sold on the idea that they have bad gut health. But hopefully like learning about it makes them more interested in, eating fruits and vegetables and whole grains and getting physical activity. But yeah, I really wish that we didn't have to like sell a problem. And that's definitely something that I don't sell a problem. I'm just kind of like, this is what the research says. And I try to balance that, the perspective of like, here's the science versus the science fiction, because I do want people to make informed decisions. So maybe that's like finding the sweet spot there of like an informed decision and the information, and also having kind of a story to tell with it. And that makes it more digestible.
Absolutely. Yeah. It makes it feel like, okay, I can do this. I've got this, right? So very much as practitioners, I feel like half of our job or more for me, especially, is to dissect and take out all the noise away from my clients and say, okay, this is what it is. This is what we know as far as the evidence goes. Now you can decide how you want to proceed with it, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's one of the most rewarding aspects of like science communication and content creation, is when I've heard from people, oh, I watched this webinar, or I heard you on a podcast, or even just like the infographics, and they're like, I didn't do this, I didn't do an IgG food sensitivity test. Like, you saved me $150 or something like that, or, I realized that all my GI distress was from the inulin that it was in this like the protein powder that I was eating all the time. I just took that out and I feel totally normal. Like they didn't have to go to the doctor and go through all of this, because they realized like, oh, this is this, very obvious low hanging fruit. Let me try that first. And it's wonderful to see people feeling better in legitimate ways, and conserving their time and energy and money, because they haven't been misled down this rabbit hole of, these are all the things that are wrong with you and all the supplements that you have to take and everything else.
And I feel like the people who get most marketed on, so to speak, is us women, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure.
To us.
Yes. Yeah. Because we, I think for so long, medicine and research have looked at women as like far too complex, and the complexity is confusing and dangerous, and something that has to be corrected in some way, or ignored if it's in the research. Like, let's just not use female participants because they have ovulatory and menstrual cycles, and it really confounds all the literature. But yeah, we're marketed to quite often because society has given us the narrative that like, as we age, we lose value. As our hormones change, we lose value. And that there's something wrong with our hormones, and that's probably why we can't lose weight. And it's I think a lot easier to sell to a group of people that has internalized the narrative that something is wrong, and they have to correct whatever that is, versus men are marketed to in very different ways. It's about like being stronger and like the aging process for them, and body changes are looked at in much more humorous, like lighthearted ways. Yeah. So like men will age like wine and women age like milk, kind of thing. And yeah, so it's definitely much easier to market to us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. It's been wonderful talking to you. Let us know how people can reach out to you, where they can find your stuff, your material, they can sign up to your coaching. Where can we find you?
Absolutely. So I'm on Instagram at Vitamin PhD. And then I also have my website, vitaminphdnutrition.com. Those are the best ways to reach me. Or if you want to shoot me an email, it's just vitaminphdnutrition@gmail.com.
Yeah. Have you got any new webinars coming up for 2023? Any new series?
I have a large project that is still currently under wraps that should be released late this year, so probably in the fall, or maybe very early next year. So that's really exciting. That is gut health related. Once I'm done working on that mid-year, I'm going to be starting another program that's going to be more coaching focused. So this year is going to be a little bit quiet from me, but like I said, the end of this year and into next year, I have some really big plans and I'm really excited for them. So that's all I can say right now. But if people do want to watch some webinars, like the webinar series that you mentioned, that was my Gut Health with Gab webinar series and was super fun.
Amazing. It was absolutely amazing. I love it.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you liked it. It was super fun to put on. It was different from anything I've done before because it was a combination of like, I gave some talks and I brought on speakers. And so people can purchase that at the website as well. You can get a single replay or a few of them, or you can get the whole series.
I'm going to put all the links down on the
yes.
for the app. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So that would be a place that I would recommend getting started. But yeah, just keep your eyes peeled because there's definitely going to be more content.
I'm looking forward to all your stuff, whatever you're bringing, bring it on. We're ready. Like I said, there's so much that even as nutritionists, health and fitness professionals, I feel like, yeah, I want to really get good in this area so I can coach my athletes holistically, because you want to see the whole picture. Absolutely. Right? And if there is something that I need to refer them out to see a doctor or a dietitian or something, then I know what I'm working with, as opposed to working blind, which is what it feels like sometimes.
I totally get that. Yeah. Believe me, there are like so many things that I wanted to address and, in terms of like helping the industry. So at some point in time, there are going to be things I'm going to have CEUs attached to. I think it's really important for us to start putting together something that is really evidence-based in the gut health sphere.
As health and fitness professionals, for those of us who haven't gone down the route that you have around gut health, what do you recommend would be the best place for us to start studying about all of this, apart from your webinars, which are amazing? Like,
thank you.
Start there.
So I do have the Gut Health Science book that's sold on the Renaissance Periodization website. Now, I want to say that because I started that several years ago and it took a couple of years to write, that's going to need to be updated, but it still is really good foundationally. And it's not going to have probably, I will say in most cases, none of the information is going to be incorrect. It's just going to be missing some things that have been discovered in the last 2 years, but I still would strongly recommend that. The other place that I would recommend would be going to Coursera and getting and watching the free course from Rob Knight. His lab headed the Human Microbiome Project. And that is a course on the basics of the microbiome and how it's researched, and it's very accessible. And I think that is another great place to start. And then, yeah, definitely the webinars. And then I also do provide coach mentoring and consulting. So if a person wanted to work with me one-on-one, just on a standalone consult to say, I've got this client with some weird stuff going on, or ongoing for really intensive education, that's also an option.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That's amazing. Okay, people, I hope you reach out. I'm hoping this conversation was useful. Gabby, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for giving us your time and educating us. I had so many other questions, but I'm being very careful with time and stuff like that. But I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.